In the Darkness I See by Anon Y. Chapter 2. My Time in Peru. My visit to Peru, of keystone importance, began and ended in the cool month of July, in a misty rainforest retreat. My lovely escape was surrounded by plush forest, uncharted by most, and just a couple of miles outside of Iquitos. The foggy mornings, each and all, failed not in transfixing me, their delightful combined grandeur propelling me further out of myself with each iteration. The morning mists moved like molasses through the mountains, capturing all within their cooling power. The repeat engulfings took a hold of my mind and captivated my senses. Although all-encompassing and intensely voluminous, the fogs were consistently peaceful, never harming anything in direct contact. The slow absorptions of landscape into the masses seemed to silver my soul. My admiration was not drawn directly from the picturesque quality of the brooding brooms looming lavishly atop the trees. It was their symbolic meaning that intrigued me. The plumes of invigorating vapor, those amorphous majesties, moved like universes, their hydrating impetuses forcing them across the valley, into the town, and through my dwelling, every morning, without fail. The hazy conglomerations were not just continuums of water droplets, representatives of the dynamic nature of densities and pressures. They were units of time incarnated. Each installation of heavenly hydrating, dynamic appellation was familiar to me somehow as, no matter how structured, organized, or stunning the pre-misted vista had been, the gallant trot of moist time came in to rivet all its anti-victims and engross them with its diaphanous embrace. From those incidences, I was able to distill the quintessential message of life and death. The locals called it La Garua. I called it my beginning rebirth. Although I had instantly found Peru, and assumptively all of South America, alluringly beatific, I had not visited Peru for the pulchritudinous peering. I was there for a spiritual awakening. Through the Andean trunk, Bolivia, Peru, Ecuador, Colombia, and Venezuela, and with the aid of some people in the know, I had cartographically and multivernacularly searched and lettered and found and frenzied traveled off with an intensity that only a middle-aged man without a family could have mustered. The long-standing concentrations of ritualistic tribes that celebrated the use of a certain hallucinogenic tonic had been found and was now within my grasp. What polar transformative thoughts I would have after thinking such a thing. The mixture was made mainly from the ayahuasca plant, most directly translated to vine of the dead, and yet I was so sure that it was to revivify me. As I taxied and walked towards the shaman, I repeatedly read the note that a gentleman named Amos Katz had given to me months before. The damp and panic-softened note read as follows. The ayahuasca vine, mixed with chacruno leaves to aid in the metabolization of the vine, will drive your heart into the jungle and out from yourself. This bountiful beverage allows you to enter the realms of palpable perception only reserved for deep sleep. After all, the human body at rest is said to synthesize a minuscule amount of the main psychedelic component in ayahuasca called N,N-dimethyltryptamine, or DMT. Inconclusive as this idea may be, you will see soon enough that dreamscapes must be the result of this synthesis and its rampaging synaptic gap reactions, or something strikingly similar. So, with DMT, the dreams and their lessons come up from the darkness and grasp your awake reality. There is no more hiding from behind your mind once you find yourself in the vine. To actualize my modern prejudices' lasting protective suspicions, I spent an unspecial span of the morning before finalizing my journey towards the transcendental, ineffectively whisper recounting some shard of wisdom I had surely half plagiarized. "In order to earnestly call myself academically honest," I grumbled, "it is imperative to first-hand test these ideations that I have so willingly shared with my peers." I suppose that at least half of that sentiment was mine by way nuance, because in my much younger years I had written a small thesis titled "The Confrontation of PTSD with the Use of Psychedelic Pharmaceuticals." Within my research, I had discovered the revolutionary capacity of the substance. Almost all of the usually troubled subjects to whom the DMT had been administered revealed either decreased PTSD symptomologies or increased overall life satisfaction. Most of the subjects ended their time with both of those positive outcomes integrated into their brains functioning and their souls recording as a result of an entirely new perspective on life, and more importantly, more potently, death. It had taken many years to muster the courage to brave the unsure waters of my unconscious mind, but there I was, on my way. My partaking in the ceremony had not been fully activated by my study of the field, but rather by my Jungle Notes writer, my good friend Amos Katz. What a strange night our first meeting had been. I reminisced about Amos as I began the final stretch of walking towards my end-begotten re-beginning, intermediately reaching still for my folded advisory. That night of eruptive collision grew in providentially destined obviousness and in thickly entrancing clarity with each thought backwards, the jungle densifying concurrently. Strangely, what my mind found most readily worthy of remembrance within that first meeting, in the belly of our shared musky social club, was our most initial confused confrontation, with Amos lounging languidly across the beaded leather couch, and I his oddly mislabeled servant. I remembered his wafery hand as it beckoned me over, and, as if magnetized like cold iron to charged pole, I strode nervously towards him. Instantaneously, even before our anonymity had dissipated, I felt a special uneasiness, his grey hair and tight features standing in high direct contrast. His face, neither particularly attractive nor symmetrical, drew me in as though it had been painted by Rayburn himself. The first words spoken were too unpredictable to be unplanned. "Another bourbon," robustly ordered Amos. "Under Katz. That's my usual." I knew that a man of my stature was never to have been known to become flustered or bombastic in the face of such scrutiny, equal members of the social club as we surely were. Against my Russian root's best judgment, I had to recompose myself. In my comporting self properly preparation, I first dulled my completely conflicting duality with a desperate application of Occam's razor. Secondarily, to reduce the questions rapier-like rawness reveal, showing heavily in my troubled face, turned into one big, angered wrinkle, I methodically tested and readied my retort, ensuring response deliverance by way of civility that only an indisputably mature prefrontal cortex could manage. The problem of the situation, as I knew it, was not only that a singular sentence, a series of 7 words, 13 syllables, could castrate me into self-castigation, but that the coming clarification was to reveal only more about me and my needs than the initial, hopefully misplaced order. One sentence to truly test my hollow self-perception. Although I had spent many, misapprehended as effortful years, emboldening my sense of masculinity and deliverance from the peaceful tranquility of my little corners, in the shadows of my consciousness, I had truly frozen in my moment of inglorious confrontation. In his question, drained of all deference, I had receded expeditiously into the same cavern from which my pride and ego had been falsely derived. With such ease he had nimbly uprooted and deconstructed my tenacious desire to be a respected member of my tribe, the intellectuals. I was the stupid little immigrant boy once again, stripped of all my vapid vitality. He had served me to myself. Worst of all, I was unsure if he had simply succumbed to an unfortunate mischaracterization, or if he was vindictively targeting me. Thus, my reactionary rebuttal was an uncertain path forward. I replied to Amos, first nameless to me, with much angry disillusionment. "I am not a server here," I stated, almost shouting. His reply was even more troubling, saying, "Another bourbon, please." I rejected his raised glass and stumbled off, fuming. Later on that evening, when the gleeful cheer of pretentious camaraderie had faded, and almost everyone except for Amos and I had evacuated back to their lives, wives, or archives, he wandered over to my little nook. Within the room's most discreet crevice, where I felt most comfortable, I dwelled gloomily. The simple trouble of that evening had scrambled my mind and cut through all the drivel and banter of the Requiem Social Club. All my necessary grey matter was totally devoted to the conquering of my opponent without further confrontation. I had read all of Aquinas, Frankl, Jung, and Nietzsche. I had understood and preached to my clients about the urgency of self-attribution of struggle and the integration of one's own overcoming spirit to the point of perfunctorization. But at my own real testing point of becoming a beguiling maestro of mastered violence and acerbic straightforwardness, I became trapped within the smallest version of myself. Übermensch I was not. Once Amos had situated himself across from me in the booth, I hastened to rectify his interpretation of me. Because my restrained demeanor could have signaled weakness to him, I made sure to clarify my position and close the seemingly open invitation to trample my pride. In other words, I was unwilling, to communicate my message of war within the confines of composed, unvulgar prose. And so, with the predictability of a janitor at midnight, I began assailing him from my shadowy corner. Simultaneously, I inchwise revealed the intensity of my tensing body, using more and more of the dull alcoholic light's intensity to mean as much as involuntarily possible. Each of my pejoratives projected was a spear into the heart of whom I had convinced myself Amos was or would become given time. As I increasingly asserted myself, he remained unmoved. His damp stare was like that of a naughty child. Piercing through my verbal onslaught with the devilish glimmer of a smile, Amos seemed satisfied with our shared unease. In that moment, my verbal prowess could have been that of a clairvoyant, approximating perfect preciseness and punctiliousness, and it still would have been futile in deconstructing his pride as I had wished by decree of decimated mine. Eventually, the second intellectual battle, another predictor of many to come between but entangle us, was waged and won, the victor clear after another small bout of syllables. His concise words, no embellishments, stood fast and firm. "You respect your elders, don't you?" That conglomeration of soundful meanings, almost crystalline with its piercing effect, so effortless in construction, silenced me again. That moment was the inception of the game that we played, the morally virtuous game, with no real winner ever revealed, just a meticulous dance of mental agility. The search for the truly superior thinker, and thus the better man, began. I was never too weary of the assiduous ambition lying beneath all men's hearts, betwixt their mothers and fathers, their brothers and sisters, intertwined with passion and courage. So the game bothered me little. The drive for the preeminence over all combatants coursed through us. We had both climbed the intellectual ladder and become true scholars. Bored of our ascension, we desired a move from a physical realm to an essential one, most manifestations of the former needing not much more than nous and simple expressionism to subsume its nuances into boring trivialities. We wanted pure sage wisdom. Our heightened, combining adversarial intellect eventually became a visceral roughness between us. It was, however, as inconsequential as two Neanderthals back and forth beating. We sat on, grovelling not over food or mating rights, but rather over things of less apparent importance, and so surely thusly we spoke like gold miners awaiting our nuggets of truth. Though we both understood the futility of our uncompromising biology, our vestigial prefrontal simplicity gripped us tightly. Deep within the inner functionality of our brains and their underlying chemistries, our drive for domination swelled in each other's presence. After my first annihilation had been made clear to me, and my newly found teacher had become most comfortable, I accepted semi-defeat and silently set up my comprehensive drainage system of discourse deconstruction and additive translation, running in that nifty back-of-front mind of mine. I was ready to filter all the understandings and pontifications that would fall out of his mouth. Through my conscious and unconscious biases and refutations, they journeyed. After a few hours and some linguistic lubrication, we got along just fine. After all the shallow theorizations had come and been concluded, we began discussing the real reason for us being at a social club at 1:30 in the morning. We remained, lost souls seemingly damned to become unforgiven voyagers traveling to the unknown with no compass. He abruptly asked, "What is your current standing on the religious and spiritual beliefs held within the context of the Western world today?" "How to begin to answer that?" I retorted. Well, it is an unimportant question to those who can surpass the derivation of value through a morally reductive lens. That question, beautifully grandiose, is the perfect distraction for those who cannot ascend the ranks of comprehension and discover the circular reasoning behind moral virtue. Frustrated, he leaned back and questioned, "Circular reasoning?" I recapitulated, firmly saying, "The morals of the traditional Judeo-Christian belief system, so acclaimed and adhered to, are basic human tendencies towards non-zero-sum community structures. We simply self-serve through a common mediator. Hence, that determination that we are good because God is inside of all of us truly means that God is good because he is made up of us all, making God a definitionally human construct. The circular reasoning comes at the expense of justified morality. We are good as defined by the God our goodness defines. While yes, the success of this ethos creates a successful society and culture insofar as it explains the inexplicable complexity of IQ and above-self abstraction, and that achievement further strengthens the efficacious nature of its own translational commanding common mediating system deemed supreme, it fails as we explain away the mystery. My reference, you may ask? How about the last 150 years or so? All who reap the rewards of triumphant peace espouse the virtue of God. In actuality, these peacetimers champion the fulfillment of a mutually beneficial mediation machine. Furthermore, according to most interpretations of the Scriptures, we are here to please God. This is the God that we have refined from the battle between the good and evil residing within all of us. All in all, we are pleased when emboldening the holiness within ourselves, leading back to the self-service we tried desperately to escape. His response was short and sweet, quickly huffing and shouting, "Another!" As I began translating another one of my thoughts into speech, I was interrupted again by him. "Not you," he corrected. He held up his drink. The barman, on his way out, took the glass and politely asked us to leave. I was hooked. It was no longer a game of fluctuating supremacy, makeable possible. He was the master, and I his humble student. Rather confusing was that instant relationship. There was no degree of merit that he held over me, no discernible difference in wit or aptitude, and yet some fabrication from my ancient brain told me to respect him and seek his approval. More obvious conclusions could have been drawn, such as a desire for a secondary father figure to strengthen my emaciated paternal linkage, or perhaps a redirected urge for connection that my sexual promiscuity failed to fulfill. Those conclusions were both confronted and categorized as peripheral to my amazement of his ineffable Blythe. He always remained rigidly sharp in tongue and thought, but so relaxed and demure in temperament. He was indescribably alluring. From that evening on, we made it a habit to meet up and discuss the objective truth behind all things. Rather, I would try to impress him with some modern approach to psychological evaluation, connecting it with problematic assertions made by the greats, and he would listen, grunt, and fail to be impressed. On one such occasion, in my exercise of imagination, I incorporated the teachings of B.F. Skinner with the ponderances of Empedocles. With all its girth, I had to write it out on a napkin before speaking it into half-truth. First, I wrote Empedocles' description of perception, and then, simultaneously scribbling, I mumble exalted, as a transient flow of energy, through pores, as he calls them, and sensory organs, as well as his later description of the life force energy traveling through the cosmos, coincides perfectly with Skinner's thoughts on the biological sensations as being of chief import. His response to that exuberant theory was as blasé as ever, grumbling, "Lovely theory, but much trouble comes to those who find solace in others' minds." We continued in the same sophisticated aimlessness for the remainder of the night. Again and again I researched and discussed the intricacies of such theories. Each time I delivered a perfectly crafted message to demonstrate my worthiness. His answers inevitably spoken with defiance and an unimpressed tone, almost consumptive of nothing but consistency, taking my contributions out at the knees and unveiling my shallow rectitude. Within the polar lights of another night, I recall comparing the likes of Maslow and Aristotle, or perhaps Plato. Ah, yes, it was Plato. I recall even my mispronunciation of Plato as our dwarf-labeled planetoid. You say Pluto, I remember joking. I say Plato. Platato, Plutato, Platoto, Plutoto. We both laughed meagerly into hysterically at that, sharing in much pain. My hurt was generated by the lingering shame of potential shattered perception brought about by my pickled tongue's switching of person and planet, and his was made from his great knowing of his power over me, way over there. We brushed off the momentary proof of truth in clarity, and I continued mining myself free of all other associated categorizations of science, humans, and living things. I droned on for hours, and he simply gifted one or two reactions of substance, with a faint smile only worn by him under the zeroed scruples of truly remarkable discoveries echoed between my just more than tongue and cheek. Fluttering through the empty space between us, sparks flew. Eventually, I gave in, saying, "Why and how do such things not call for some semblance of recognition within you? No outright additions can be made to my assertions without traveling through time, digging up ancient relics, and conducting intricate investigation, of which neither of us have time. I have read all that humanity has. I have examined all there is to know from the greatest minds, and yet nothing comes from you. Why?" With his fine half-grown smile finally broken done, he elaborated. "I spent much time doing the same things as you," he whispered. "So faux graciously, too, you see. I listed off all that I knew, and nothing met me halfway. It all led me back to the same empty crevasse. Using that methodology, that one you used today, right now, right here, after countless sleepless nights, I found myself at the top of the Park Imperial building, 10:30 in the morning. Nothing but a whispery gust was needed to propel my body into the infinite jaws of the unknown. No truth was ever grand enough to fill me with the peace I ventured to capture. It was then that I learned that peace is not to be subjugated by us at all. Peace is for those who... Perhaps you are not ready. We fell silent for some time, my sub-face cringing at his end statement's unoriginality, but my soul dancing to know him. Regretting my initial probe, I asked what had pulled him to safety, off that building of his. After composing his thoughts, he returned to his retelling. There it was, he said, across the way, my exact sofa, owned by someone else. Marvelously crafted by Lionel Gravelli, with its perfect bust and understated accent pillows like fluffed pristinity. It was just sitting there, looking at me. A woman was there too, in the wide window-framed painting, boisterously draped over it, restlessly writhing in its embrace. It called to me to revisit my warm apartment one last time. What forestalled your return to that ledge? I asked with frenzied curiosity. As the last of my question hit him, and I panned from his right eye to all around his face, informationally absorptive my glare, I noticed his demeanor had been drastically dulled. I couldn't believe it. He had actually been drained from the retelling, his face's usual light sheen cleaned free. Sadness, an emotion I had not seen from him before, was wearing him like an overcoat. It was only when I returned home, he continued, from those brisk strides with death that I realized my life's next act. I sank myself into my perfect sofa, now not so potent as had been reverse portentously self-convinced prophesied, and, as comfortably as a newborn upon breast, I read the newspaper. I took in first the daily crime column. Its heading was like a diamond in sunlight, reading, "New drug DMT, roots in South America." From that paper I was provided with a regimented list of DMT effects, and into the search for more I was pulled. I read additional studies from my alma mater where I learned of the ancient origins of the drug. It was never made for recreation. It was consumed to align the soul with the world, a reconciliation with one's more than own identity. I booked a trip to Peru that same week, and, with the help of my shaman Alberto, I discovered myself. As soon as I took that DMT, I tell you, Mark, I tell you, there was the answer to my dilemma. In that moment, I was more than an intellectual or teacher. I was the embodiment of exploration. I was nothingness, and then something, and then humanity, and then myself, and then I was everything. And then there was nothing called then. Amos's eyes ran dark, and red wine dripped clear down his face as he continued. Back to a fluctuating whisper of cognized reality still, he opined on, crying, "The magnetization to that place had been so intense. I finally understood why." He followed by letting himself loose, crying out through the tears, into that dark and empty bar, at and through me. "I want to go back. There's nothing here for me but that couch. Oh, that dreadful couch." After his tears had dried, he explained to me why he could never return, for his trip had not ended in Peru. From there, Amos had ventured north to Colombia, where, as growingly predictable as he was swelling to be in my searingly watery eyes, he had become involved with a certain problematic powder, as he childishly called it. He had found his heart, and then had decided to false fill it. After traveling over the border, back to his original taste of divinity, the Peruvian government seized him and his drugs. They threw him in jail for enough time to realize how to grease palms, and then he was expediently extradited back home, never to return to his beloved shaman. Following these, Amos's initial footsteps, I made the same journey south into the jungle to find my answer in totality. That had been my introduction to Peru. After the half-day's travel had finished, my reminiscing too, and all us still not a many words spoken between strugglers of life-affirming, meaning-rich satiety, realized that the structure and the human beside it, in the shortening distance, was our destination. I took a centered moment to marvel at the place of my retribution to come, a man and a structure. We all had finally arrived, and I was lost to enter that prestigious shack. No verbal greeting was given, only a waft of the hand gesturing us to sit. Not much more of the start to that entering graces me with ready remembrance. I do remember, however, the circle of attendees, none of much notoriety. Many of them were dissatisfied youths that could have found solutions in their problems within the comfort of their own towns or cities, speaking to any professional psychiatrist, names adorned with 3 letters, Ph.D. The experience seemed to be just another shallow distraction for them. Their prosperous future was just a potential bonus. Nonetheless, those people took part in the ritual with open minds and bodies. There was, too, an older lady inhabitant of our controlled insanity. About my age, in fact. After the sub-spirit formalities were over, breathing sessions were undertaken to stimulate alignment. Some other ceremonialities also followed until eventually the ayahuasca was administered. The burning bitter taste compelled me to gag immediately, and from that point of initial reaction, my nausea only strengthened. I retched several times. While the physical symptoms of the drug were obviously uncomfortable, I knew of the discomfort well beforehand, and so was able to place their surface distracting effects at the back of my mind. Of course, this was with the help of the shaman and some mysterious aids that had seemed to appear from nowhere. The mental activity was incredible. All the while the psychological reactions were taking place, we were instructed to sit upright and hum at the most stereotyped tone. Soon after that collective humming harmonized, my second puking session began. With my neck roasting from the acidic aftermath of my stomach's revolt, I tried distorting my body into a myriad of inhuman positions to ease the aching. It was all worth it. The shaman, using colorful feathers interwoven into a mitten-like glove, passed over my face a multitude of times, the tingle of which has never slipped my mind. As if carrying my hefty body through the looking-glass and into the spiritual realm, he then caressed me. His hands were dried and cracked from years of concocting that putrid, perfect, DMT-laden beverage. But the truth of that skin that managed to spring me from those helping hands and into revelation, that was saturated absolute. My vision began to distort. Soon following my transient sight's delusion, a sickening serenade also ensued. My trenchant heartbeat grew, pounding throughout my entire body, reverberating through me. After some time, I was offered a mental choice: to lose myself completely or stay normal. I chose the former. I cannot explain what happened after my unconscious mind had made that decision. Amos, however, had described a passage between stagnation and realization long before I had gone to Peru. He had used the colloquial door to depict the autonomy of that choice, and to help me explain the sudden breached entry into the mechanisms of my mind that was to ensue after my realizing myself and seem before releasing myself. I, in my trance, saw that passage. My path was long and narrow, but so gloriously bright. I could taste it, the cleanliness that resided without me. For a timeless moment, I felt my presence would only serve to ravish the pristine passageway with the filth, as my more-than-me voice repeat called it. It was not guarded by any dichotomous threshold. It peered into me indifferently. I felt warm as the light and eye searched within me. We made no judgments. Good from evil, knowledge from ignorance, divinity from humanity. Their polar meanings' repercussions became as ineffectual as my resistance to the toxins that flowed through my body. There was nothing but it and I. I begged us for entry. The long tunnel of light was embellished with a black hole. The stark change from black to white rang with perfect balance along the circular border of my newest intrigue. Somehow, I knew that the circle was only a two-dimensional representation of a definite sphere. Affixed within the vast brightness, the orb irradiated its darkness into me. The decision was final. I knew immediately that one step towards the anti-light would pull me in with the might of 100 men. I leapt in. The next confused hours were spent truly inside the menacing realities of my life. The choices I had made, and the assorted reasons why, all faced me at once. The truth was revealed to me repeatedly in the form of hands. From left to right, and top to bottom, they surrounded me and grasped, mangled, and moved me. I danced in their palms for a while, and then nothingness engulfed me. Suddenly, a hand pressured down on me from the abyss above, squashing me into a pool of knowledge. From my former form, I flowed down a glass tube filled with memories and relationships into a beaker. Once I was bubbling within the beaker, consciousness zoomed out. With perfect clarity, I saw the distillation setup through which my new form had just flowed. Then I proceeded to flow through another section of the apparatus, and another, and another. Throughout the process, I revisited all the pain and hurt picked up during my time on Earth. My fluidity graced me with timelessness as I became enchanted by the great souvenirs of my life. Unrestrained, I had finally burst from my temporal entrapment and flourished. The process was neither painful nor splendorous, only didactic. No matter what form I took, my meaning became more concentrated, held within the precipitates of each synthesis step. As I passed through each stage of my emporium of evocations, all the significance was not in me, but rather of a fabric, entangled within the trail of existence. I was only who I had become, and then only who we remembered. Words could only understate the visually inconceivable happenings that ravished all of me in those moments following my cognizance of individuation. As I shifted between powerful hallucinations of physical change, my soul danced with great conviviality. I was too, and then and simultaneously now transported to a conception of the fourth dimension, the warping of time and space into perfect geometries and planar arrays, ravishing my eyes. The colorful activity of those complex structures kept my mind aghast until the next manipulation of my form took place. Within all the generative deconstructions gifted to me by the DMT, there was one subset of seemingly meaningless parts in which I wish I hadn't partaken. Too overwhelming in spectacle or banality to denote with words, I wished the pieces of meta-me away shortly after their inception. One memorable disgrace was me as a hot slurry of tar and oil. Once liquefied and superheated, I was poured into the face of George Washington. In another vision, I flew atop a large bird-like creature whilst it devoured a bed containing St. Peter, Darwin, and my mother. The resolution of my vision closed with a magnitude, a multitude, an enormity of hands holding me down in my childhood room for thousands of years. As the time wound on, I watched from the bottom corner of my dwelling while the room transformed. I peered at its conversion into different family rooms and offices, and then stared at the entropic powers as they took a hold of the landscape, roots distorting and breaking through the floorboards. With the precipitative drilling from above collapsing the roofing structure and rotting its protective cover, the turbulent hurricanes bombarding its walls, and then the calm zephyrs soothing the rubble, I watched everything fall to ruin. I experienced all the scenes from within me. After my room's destruction, the dynamic space turned to wondrous greenery for some time. But then the green expanse was suddenly eviscerated by a sun's luminous explosion. The bright boom blinded me. As I was white, I thought, wow, this must be the least original transcendence experience ever. Are we all really this same? We laughed, and another 1,000,000,000 years shifted on until, once visually able again, my consciousness was left floating through space. While the changes took place, the hands, one by one, released me from their collective grasp and disappeared. The closure left me feeling a total sense of tranquility. The purity of that feeling had never been so abundant as in those moments. With tears rolling from their receptacles, I slowly floated back to reality. On my knees, I wept for an additional hour or so. Screaming at my past and hoping for my future, I trembled with anticipation for my next adventure. Shaking, I eventually rose from the muddied grass patch I had torn up. I looked around for my troubled peers, my being barely holding on to reality. Concluding my search, I only found my shaman, sitting, smoking, and staring back at me in silence. "There is so much more to come," said my teacher. The shaman then wished me well in continued silence, placing a feather in my hand. I smiled with great ease. With a throbbing head and a bloodied nose, I stumbled off, my body vile once again. That serenity heart, that precise emotion, I never found it again. Once I had successfully traversed my way lonesomely back to my temporary home just outside of the jungle, I cried again. Those tears poured with such abundance that they could have filled tens of thumb thimbles. Dehydrated and withdrawn, I returned to my bed and slept like a train in sand. That night, no dreams were had. The remainder days of my trip were spent thoughtfully remembering what I could of my more actual trip and analyzing each partial experience. While thoughtfully paralyzed, biliousness struck me over and over. I chalked it up to the repercussions of filtering strange substances, and, with my piles of paper damp and fragile from the jungle's humid onslaughts, I worked on, eventually writing in small, large text upon a wall. "Freud was right," I wrote. "Freud was right," I furiously scribble-scratched. "Freud was right!" Not only did I ignorantly by way freshly realize the perfection of Freud's explanatory framework for the human experience, that was his theorization of human consciousness as that famous triplet balancing act, but too and more so did I marvel atop the soapy upped base of his box. That man, so hated by me before, was so quickly deemed right. I had been determined, in every facet of my work, to disavow him. I had felt that he had placed people into eternally restrictive boxes, his work like moribund salutes to free will, too weak to bend to the dynamic nature of people. But now, with my misdirected envy finally understood, I danced in acceptance. Like a brilliant bass thrown into an information pond, I gulped down all his work, reading through all the literature I was able to have emailed to me. It became quite clear as I combined my experience with Freud's work why his use of drugs had been so imperative to his theorizations. The various state changes brought on by such taboo elixirs simply made outside observances of internalisms. As the days passed, realizations were commonplace, becoming almost physically draining. By the end of it, I had iso-deluded myself into certainty on many things. For instance, I really thought that I was onto something full and final. That the theories of ours, yes, ours, simply temporally separated, could control, could take, as fillable and finalizable, could become encapsulate fullable. What a thought of thoughts. It was all, in the end, shattered by fright, the last night spent in the city of Iquitos almost killing me. In the spirit of, when in Rome, do as the O'Rourkes, I thought it best to become inebriated with an assortment of South American beverages. I visited El Musmuki, a local pub. After some numbed drinking, the bar closed. I took my last shot of tequila and stumbled to a taxi to take me to the airport. Before I could enter my exit, though, I was captivated by something in the periphery of the nighttime. There they were, three shadows lurking in the noxious putrefaction reserved only for a star-lit, septic alleyway of a nowhere-adjacent town. Three suited men loitered, one tall and slender, another round and plump, the third perfectly average. They were just standing there, and, with the confidences of countries, were looking for or at something just around the corner. My curiosity was piqued. I asked the taxi to wait a moment while I investigated. Like a simple creature called to a fire, or an entranced insect compelled to a flower, I moved towards them. I quickly closed in on the three hazy figures, my senses dulled from the booze. Once in close quarters, their mystical outlines unblurred to reveal their details. I soon enough found myself standing beside the tallest of the few. Wearing a black suit with the letters P.A. pinned to his lapel and his eyes sunken into his skull, he peered down at me. The gaunt and ghostly giant had a large forehead that was juxtaposed with a hollow facial structure. It was cracked and scarred, that forehead of his, and his cheeks were lowered. I glared incoherently at him. Ravishing his visage with my sight, I discovered an additional disfigurement. What I found between eye jolts was an awful scar. It was not some calculated cicatrix made from a precisely lunged or maneuvered blade, or even a contact wound of any reasonable nature. It was a sadistic burn, devouring half his face. The feature was only lost within the jagged beginnings of his hairline. As I pieced together the gravitas of our easily spotted one-out group, the tree-like man gestured disapprovingly at me. With no discernible emotion bellowing out from his statuesque and antiquated face, he communicated his ache. Next to the Goliath, in a blue suit with a slightly skew TU affixed to his lapel, stood the one of small stature. He was slumped and comfortable, his smooth skin resembling that of a castrated child, perfectly polished and velvety. The generously bestowed rotund features made for a cartoonish appearance only opposed by the grimace his face held so uncompromisingly. The last of the three, in purple and boasting a J.U., stood at about eye level. With a face that told no story, saturated with shadows, his indescribable expression's non-geometric allure protested his suit's formal opulence. His face was remarkably unrecognizable, no discerning individuality present. In fact, it seemed to be to me, only the beginnings of a man's face, a rough outline etched. All three of the men, eyeballs focusing on my chest, and in total silence, stood steadfast. In my unsober clumsiness, they, threefold and instantaneously, diverted their blaze at me, into my eyes, at me. There was still nothing to be heard. I moved from the comfort of beside the giant and shifted my stance to the center of the alley, all eyes on my searing discomfort now. I choked up a question, asking, "I heard there was a UN meeting close by. Who are you, Jerusalem?" I pointed at the proportioned man's abbreviated pin. None of them responded. I nervously chuckled and offered an alternate greeting to them, saying, "Sorry, I meant, are you representing Jerusalem?" They remained silent and strong in their anonymity. After a moment, the third man introduced himself and his partners of such bewitching mystery. "It's time. Come with us," he said strongly. With a bubbling mixture of delirium, confusion, and fear, I retorted, "What do you mean? I'm not even from this place. I come bearing no harm." "Not here," he responded. "Then where, damn it?" I questioned. An answer materialized from the man's sacred snout once again, reverberating through my hollow chest. A message boomed. "It's time." I felt their combined desire to reach out to me, their craving to absorb me, rang in my ears. I was stuck in that eternal moment. What felt like lead shoes and millennium micro-minutes lasted on and eventually on until it all mounted in a surprise breaking of my paralysis. It was the sharp beep of my taxi that broke it. And oh, how thankful I was for that rusty savior as its echoing shocks reverberated through that alley. With my heart thumping through my chest and a black hole called me needing gone to be, I suddenly broke my immobility. I ran so fast and so needfully towards that taxi, and still my spirit stayed strides ahead of me, its formless elasticity pulling on me to aid in my acceleration just enough. "Oh, please," I cried wordlessly, "please be just enough to escape the frightful need to be free." Solely existent blue. Expecting my pre-assailants to be in pursuit, I looked back. They hadn't followed. They didn't move. I jumped into the cab, and we sped off into the strangely comforting darkness of the jungle. From the dirty rear windshield, I looked back for the men again. Only their memory remained. Once back in the comfortable hierarchy of my hometown, and remainingly wanting to further grow my understanding of reality, I became obsessed with the use of DMT. I had captured a glimpse of the universe through the eyes of God, the collective being, only spliced into subsections by the blade of subjective consciousness, and so being back in my separative skin stinkingly stung. Oh, though, how that woeful épée was so willfully sheathed and dulled by my subsequent substances. With my brief organic chemistry background, permitted access to a colleague's lab, and a mimosa hostiles root powder connection from Connecticut, I indulged in weekly trips, then monthly trips, and then... I never reached equal potency of that shaman's mixture. The serendipitous force of life exclusionary after. Each new time my father was with me, watching from above. Sitting on his glorious throne, so unburdened, his ubiquitous glow embraced me throughout each new journey. I have not translated a single total thing here. This has been Chapter 2 of In the Darkness I See by Anon Y.